There is a rule in warfare that every strategist understands. You do not defeat a fortress by throwing yourself against its walls. You defeat a fortress by turning the people inside it against the commander who locked the gates. And at exactly 7:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight, something happened that Washington was not prepared for. Something that may change the entire trajectory of this crisis. Because instead of attacking the fortress from the outside, Mark Carney walked straight through the front door. In the middle of prime time on CNN Newsroom, the Prime Minister of Canada sat down across from Anderson Cooper, looked directly into a camera watched by more than 18.7 million Americans, and did something that no foreign leader has ever done in the history of the United States. He made his case directly to the American people. Not through a press release, not through diplomats behind closed doors, not through carefully scripted statements read by aides standing at podiums thousands of miles away. He sat in the chair. He looked straight into the lens. And for 37 uninterrupted minutes, Mark Carney spoke directly to the citizens of the United States, to the people whose president, according to him, had been misleading them for 5 straight weeks, to the workers whose jobs could be at risk, to the families watching energy prices rise, to the voters whose national security was now entangled in a conflict between 2 neighboring democracies. And then something happened that detonated like a political earthquake. Carney played real audio from a recorded diplomatic call between himself and Donald Trump. On that recording, the President of the United States could be heard threatening to destroy Canada's economy, warning that if Canada did not comply with American demands, it would be turned into what he called an economic wasteland. This was not an allegation. It was not a paraphrase. It was not a leak filtered through anonymous sources. It was Trump's voice, Trump's words broadcast on American television for millions of Americans to hear with their own ears. And just when it seemed impossible for the moment to become more dramatic, Carney did something that instantly transformed the interview from a diplomatic explanation into a political challenge. He looked directly into the camera and addressed the President of the United States. Mr. President, he said calmly, I invite you to join me on live television to debate this issue. Any network, anytime, any moderator you choose, all you have to do is show up. A foreign leader sitting on American television had just challenged the sitting president of the United States to a public debate about his own policies, and within hours, Trump refused. That single refusal told the American public more than any speech ever could. Because in politics, sometimes what a leader refuses to do speaks louder than anything he says. Tonight's broadcast was not simply an interview. It was a carefully engineered political operation, the culmination of a 5-week strategy that unfolded step by step, each stage designed to dismantle a specific piece of the narrative coming from the White House. And to understand just how devastating this moment was for Washington, you have to walk through the interview exactly the way it happened, because what viewers witnessed was not a casual conversation. It was a prosecution. Every question that Anderson Cooper asked had been anticipated. Every answer had been prepared. Every piece of evidence was deployed at precisely the moment it would cause maximum political impact. The interview began with what sounded like a simple question. Why had Canada taken such aggressive economic measures against the United States? But Carney did not answer that question the way politicians usually do. He did not start with economic statistics. He did not begin with policy arguments or complicated trade explanations. Instead, he started with something far more powerful. He started with the story. Let me be very clear about something. He said, Canada did not start this crisis. And then he began listing facts one by one. Canada did not impose tariffs on American goods in violation of a signed trade agreement. Canada did not suggest that American states should become Canadian provinces. Canada did not threaten to dismantle defense arrangements protecting the entire North American continent. According to Carney, every one of those actions had come from the White House. President Trump did those things, he said plainly. Canada responded to aggression. We did not initiate it. 6 sentences, each one short, each one precise, each one almost impossible to dispute. And in those 6 sentences, Carney completely reframed the crisis. Instead of Canada appearing aggressive, the narrative suddenly flipped. Now Canada looked defensive. Now the United States looked like the instigator. And before a single document had been shown or a single recording had been played, the moral framework of the entire conversation had already been established. Canada was defending its sovereignty. The United States, at least according to Carney, had chosen confrontation. That framing became the foundation for everything that followed. Because if viewers accepted that premise, then every Canadian action from financial retaliation to diplomatic pressure could be interpreted not as escalation but as self-defense. That was the architecture Carney built in the first 3 minutes. And then he started presenting evidence. When Cooper asked about the tariffs imposed by the United States, Carney did something unusual for television interviews. He reached down and lifted a physical document, not a summary, not talking points, the actual trade agreement governing commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, commonly known as USMCA. He held it up so the camera could see it. Then he cited a specific clause, Article 2.4. He explained that the clause explicitly prohibits tariffs between the three countries except under very limited circumstances. And according to him, the tariffs imposed by the Trump administration did not meet those conditions. Then he pulled out a second document. This one was even more damaging. A ruling from the USMCA Dispute Resolution Panel dated February 20th, 2026. The ruling was unanimous. It concluded that the tariffs placed on Canadian goods by the United States violated the trade agreement and should be removed immediately. Two documents, one showing the law, the other showing the ruling that the law had been broken, both displayed live on American television. Carney paused for a moment and then delivered the line that would echo across political media for the rest of the night. When the White House says Canada is acting unreasonably, he said they are ignoring the fact that an international tribunal agreed with Canada's position unanimously. In other words, according to that ruling, the United States had broken its own trade agreement and the president had chosen to ignore the decision. That is not spin. That is not interpretation. It is a legal fact supported by a documented ruling. And because the ruling exists publicly, the White House cannot simply deny it. The foundation of Trump's narrative that Canada was behaving unfairly had just been cracked open. But the most explosive moment of the interview was still ahead because Cooper then asked about something the White House had been trying to downplay for days: a phone call. A call that had taken place on March 3rd between Mark Carney and Donald Trump. According to the administration, it had been a routine diplomatic conversation that ended early due to scheduling issues. Carney's version of events was very different, and when he spoke his next sentence, the atmosphere inside the studio visibly changed. "I'm going to share something with the American people," he said slowly, "that I believe they have a right to know." Even Anderson Cooper looked surprised because what came next had not been mentioned in the briefing notes. Carney revealed that the Canadian government records diplomatic calls between heads of government as a standard procedure. He explained that Trump had been aware the call was being recorded. Then he said he had received legal authorization to release part of that recording. 92 seconds of audio, a 92-second clip that would soon become the most replayed piece of political audio in modern media. When the recording began, viewers heard the unmistakable voice of Donald Trump, and the first words were already uncomfortable. "Mark, you need to understand something." Trump said, "Canada needs us more than we need you." The statement continued, "You've got 40 million people. We've got 340 million. Your entire economy depends on selling to us." Even that portion alone sounded dismissive toward a long-standing ally. But what followed was far worse. "Here's the deal," Trump continued. "You drop all this nonsense about sovereignty and respect. You sign the energy agreement I offered. You pull out of that NATO fund and we can go back to normal. Drop all this nonsense about sovereignty." Those words echoed across social media within minutes because sovereignty is not a minor political issue for any country. It is the core of national independence. And according to the recording, the President of the United States had just told Canada's leader to stop worrying about it. Then the threat came. "If you keep fighting me," Trump's voice said, "I will destroy the Canadian economy. I'll cut you off from U.S. markets. I'll make sure no American company does business in Canada." Then came the line that turned the clip into political dynamite. "I'll turn Canada into an economic wasteland." When the audio stopped, the studio was silent. For several seconds, no one spoke. Millions of Americans were hearing their president threaten the economy of one of America's closest allies. And once the clip began circulating online, the impact multiplied instantly. Within an hour, tens of millions of people had heard it. Within 2 hours, it was playing on news networks around the world, and the White House could not deny it because the administration confirmed the recording was authentic. Their response was that the remarks had been taken out of context, but that argument created another problem. If the audio exists, then the words were spoken, and many Americans were now asking the same question. What context could possibly make that threat acceptable? The earthquake had happened. But Carney was not finished because the next part of the interview revealed the countdown that could determine the future of the entire North American economic relationship. And according to Carney, the clock was already ticking. The moment the audio finished playing, the atmosphere of the interview changed completely. Until that point, the conversation had felt like a diplomatic argument, two countries disagreeing over trade, energy, and political pressure. Snorts. But once millions of Americans heard the president's own voice threatening to devastate the economy of one of the country's closest allies, the discussion moved into entirely different territory. The conversation was no longer about tariffs. It was about power. It was about credibility. And most importantly, it was about whether the United States was behaving like a partner or like a bully. For a few seconds after the recording stopped, Anderson Cooper simply looked at Carney, clearly absorbing what had just happened. The weight of the moment was obvious. This was not the type of revelation that normally occurs during a scheduled television interview, but Carney remained calm. There was no celebration in his tone, no visible satisfaction at having delivered such a devastating political blow. Instead, he spoke slowly and carefully, as if explaining something that had been misunderstood for far too long. "Yes," he said when Cooper asked for confirmation. "That is the President of the United States telling the Prime Minister of Canada that he will destroy our economy unless we surrender." He paused briefly before continuing. "That is the truth about what this crisis is actually about." Carney explained that the conflict between the two nations was not merely about trade disagreements or tariff disputes. In his view, it was about whether Canada would accept economic domination by its larger neighbor or insist on maintaining equal status as a sovereign country. "It is about independence," he said plainly. The clarity of that statement mattered because it transformed the entire conflict into something far more personal and far more understandable to ordinary viewers. Most people do not spend their evenings analyzing trade treaties or international arbitration panels. But people do understand the concept of independence. They understand the idea that no country should be forced to surrender control over its own resources or policies under threat of economic destruction. And Carney knew that the recording had created the emotional shock. Now he was building the narrative that would define how Americans interpreted it. Within minutes of the clip airing, the reaction across social media platforms was explosive. Political commentators, journalists, and analysts began sharing the 92-second segment everywhere. Hashtags related to the interview began trending almost immediately. Television networks replayed the clip again and again. Radio stations discussed it. Political podcasts began emergency episodes analyzing its implications. And inside Washington, according to several reports later that evening, staff inside the White House were scrambling to determine how to respond. But Carney was still sitting calmly in the chair across from Cooper, and the interview continued. The next question shifted the conversation toward the looming deadline that had been hanging over the entire crisis for weeks. March 18th. For viewers who had not been following every detail of the dispute, Cooper asked the obvious question, was the deadline real? Carney did not hesitate. "Yes," he said, "the deadline is real." He explained that Canada had presented the United States with 5 requirements designed to restore what he described as a normal relationship between sovereign partners. And if those requirements were not met by 5:00 p.m. on March 18th, Canada would move forward with what it called Phase 2 measures. Those measures, according to Carney, were not symbolic. They were structural. The first would be the complete suspension of energy exports from Canada to the United States. For decades, Canada has been one of America's most reliable energy suppliers, providing oil, electricity, and natural gas that power industries and households across the northern United States. Losing that supply, even temporarily, would send immediate shockwaves through energy markets. The second measure would involve withdrawal from the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the trade framework that currently governs commerce across North America. Leaving that agreement would effectively dismantle the economic architecture that has shaped trade between the 3 countries for years. The third measure would involve dissolving NORAD, the Joint Defense Command responsible for monitoring and protecting North American airspace. For more than half a century, NORAD has symbolized the military cooperation between Canada and the United States. Ending that partnership would be unprecedented. The fourth step would involve restricting operations of American banks inside Canada. And the fifth would be the launch of a new international economic partnership known as the Democratic Trade Alliance. According to Carney, the alliance would be designed to strengthen economic ties among democratic nations while reducing reliance on the United States. Each announcement landed like a hammer strike. But what made the moment particularly powerful was the tone in which Carney delivered them. He did not sound angry. He did not sound dramatic. He sounded clinical, measured, as if he were describing steps that had already been decided. "This is not a bluff," he said calmly. "This is a commitment. 8 days. That was the timeline he gave the United States. 8 days to resolve the crisis. 8 days for the White House to decide whether it would meet Canada's demands or face the consequences." The conversation then moved towards something even more sensitive: the impact of those measures on ordinary Americans. Cooper asked what Carney would say to families watching the interview who were worried about rising gas prices, electricity costs, and economic uncertainty if the conflict escalated. Carney's answer was one of the most emotionally effective moments of the entire interview. Instead of dismissing the concern, he acknowledged it immediately. "I understand that ordinary Americans will suffer if this crisis continues." He said, "I regret that deeply." That brief statement did something extremely important. It showed empathy. Carney was not speaking like an adversary attacking another country. He was speaking like a leader, aware that millions of ordinary people could be caught in the middle of a political dispute they did not create. And then he shifted the responsibility. "But I want American citizens to understand that Canada did not create this situation," he continued. "Your president did. The distinction was deliberate. He did not blame the United States." He did not criticize the American public. He placed responsibility on a single individual, Donald Trump. By separating Trump from the American people, Carney avoided appearing hostile toward the nation he was addressing. Instead, he framed the conflict as a disagreement between two leaders, one of whom he suggested had pushed the situation into crisis. Then he delivered a line that political analysts immediately recognized as strategically brilliant. "I believe most Americans," he said, "if they knew the full truth about what was demanded from Canada, would support our decision to defend ourselves." That statement did two things at once. First, it implied that the American public had not been fully informed about what had happened behind the scenes. Second, it suggested that if they were fully informed, they might actually agree with Canada's position. In other words, Carney was not speaking only as a foreign leader. He was speaking directly to American voters. And in doing so, he was subtly inviting them to question the narrative coming from their own government. But the most dramatic moment of the interview was still coming, because Cooper then asked a simple but explosive question. "What would you say to President Trump if he were sitting here right now?" Carney paused. Then he turned toward the camera and everything changed. For the first time since the interview began, Mark Carney was no longer speaking to Anderson Cooper. He was speaking through the camera straight into the homes of millions of Americans, and just as importantly, directly toward Donald Trump. "Mr. President," he began. The words were calm, measured, almost conversational, but the entire tone of the interview shifted in that instant because a foreign leader had just begun addressing the President of the United States in the middle of a live American broadcast. "You and I both know what happened." Carney said it was a subtle opening, but a powerful one. Instead of launching into accusations, he framed the moment as shared knowledge, something both leaders understood, something that had already been demonstrated to the audience minutes earlier when the recording of their call was played. "You know that you violated the trade agreement," Carney continued. "You know that you threatened Canada's sovereignty. You know that you demanded we surrender control of our natural resources." Each sentence landed with deliberate pacing, and because viewers had just heard the audio recording, the claims no longer sounded hypothetical. They sounded proven. Carney was building his argument step by step, reinforcing the idea that this conflict had not been manufactured by political spin, but by actions that had already occurred. "You heard it," he said, referring to the recording. "The American people heard it. The world heard it." Then he shifted to the future. "You have 8 days to do the right thing." Carney then calmly listed the 5 conditions Canada had set for resolving the crisis. Remove the tariffs completely, sign a renewed commitment to the North American Defense Partnership, Withdraw statements suggesting Canadian provinces should become part of the United States. Provide compensation for economic damage caused by the tariffs. Informally recognize that Canadian natural resources belong to Canada. The list was delivered without aggression. No raised voice, no dramatic language, no dramatic, just 5 straightforward conditions. These requirements are not complicated, Carney said. They are the minimum basis for partnership between sovereign equals. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of attacking Trump personally, Carney displayed something closer to empathy. I know you don't like being challenged, he said. I know you often view compromise as weakness. The comment was not delivered as an insult. It sounded more like a psychological observation. But leadership sometimes requires admitting mistakes, Carney continued, and changing course. The tone made the request sound reasonable, almost practical. And by presenting it that way, Carney created a situation where rejecting the request could appear stubborn rather than strong. Then he addressed the American audience again. The American people deserve a president who puts their interests ahead of his ego. The line hung in the air because it reframed the crisis, not as a conflict between two countries, but as a conflict between national interest and personal pride. And right now, Carney said calmly, your ego is driving America toward an economic crisis that will hurt millions of Americans. He paused. You can prevent that. Then came the moment that would dominate every political headline for the rest of the night. Mr. President, Carney said, looking straight into the camera, I invite you to join me on live television to debate this issue. The sentence sounded almost unbelievable. A foreign prime minister had just challenged the President of the United States to a public debate. You believe Canada should accept your terms? Carney continued. I believe Canada should defend its sovereignty. Let's debate it publicly. He offered complete flexibility, any network, anytime, any moderator Trump chose. The message was simple. All the president had to do was show up. And then Carney delivered the line that transformed the invitation into a trap. Do you have the courage to defend your position in a fair debate? He asked. Or will you continue to hide behind press statements and social media posts? Those words were carefully chosen because courage is one of the most important themes in Trump's public persona. Strength, confidence, fearlessness. Carney had just suggested that the president might be afraid, and millions of Americans had heard it. Cooper looked stunned. Subscribe BCC News for more updates.